Between 1663 and 1814, Britain minted a gold coin called the guinea. It was the first English coin ever struck by machine. A quarter of an ounce of gold, worth 20 shillings at first, then 22, then 30 in a bad year, then fixed at 21 and left there. It priced everything that mattered. A horse, a portrait, a barrister's opinion. And it was not named after a king, not after a mint or a river or a House of Parliament. It was named after a coastline in West Africa. The gold came from there, so the coin took the name of the shore. In 1726, 63 years after the first guinea left the press, a Dutch official posted on that same coastline sent a note back to his superiors. Gold there, he wrote, had grown so scarce that the place ought to be renamed. It should no longer be called the Gold Coast. It should be called the Slave Coast. Both of those things are on paper. Both are true. The first is true because the gold was real and the volumes were not small. In the early 1500s, this shore was shipping roughly 24,000 ounces a year into Europe, something close to 1/10 of the continent's entire supply of the metal, arriving from a stretch of surf and forest about 500 kilometers long. The Portuguese called it Costa do Ouro, the coast of gold. They were not being poetic, they were describing a balance sheet. And the second is true because by the early 1700s, the cargo had changed. In a 30-month stretch ending in 1706, English ships carried more than 10,000 people out of a single fort on this coast. Not gold, people. The metal had not left the ground. The ground was full of it. It is still full of it. What had changed was what the ships were being loaded with, and who was doing the loading, and why. So a coin was named after a coast, at almost the exact moment that coast stopped being about the thing the coin was made of. The guinea outlived the trade that named it by a century. And here is the part that refuses to sit still. The gold never ran out. In 2025, this same stretch of West Africa produced around 6 million ounces of it, more than in any year of the Portuguese trade, more than in any year of the British one, more than any other country on the continent. Something in the region of $20 billion walked and trucked and flown out, roughly 63% of everything the country exported. 500 years of extraction, and the richest year was the most recent one. So the story is not a resource running dry. That is the story people expect, and it is the wrong one. Something else happened here. Something that repeated across 4 different fortunes in 4 different centuries with 4 different commodities and produced the same shape every time. Where does the money go when the metal never stops? This is Ghana, roughly 240,000 square kilometers on the underside of the West African Bulge. A coast of grey Atlantic surf and lagoons. Behind it, a belt of forest. Behind that, savanna, thinning northward into the dry country that runs to the Sahel. 35 million people, nearly 80 languages. The first colony in sub-Saharan Africa to take its independence in March 1957. And underneath a good portion of it, in the gravel of the rivers and in quartz reefs running through rock older than almost anything on the surface of the earth, gold. Not scattered, concentrated. The Birimian rocks that run beneath the forest belt here are among the richest gold-bearing formations anywhere. When Edwin Cade sent a sample of Obuasi ore to be assayed in London in the 1890s, the result came back at 10.5 ounces to the ton. For context, most modern mines are considered viable at 1 or 2 grams. Not ounces, grams. The men working that ore in the 1890s were not prospecting. They were picking up something that had been known and worked and traded for 600 years before a European ever saw it. Which is the first thing that has to be corrected before any of the rest makes sense. The gold on this coast was not found by Europeans. It was sold to them. Long before a Portuguese sail appeared on the horizon, Akan gold was moving in the other direction entirely, north, out of the forest, through the savannah, across the Sahara by camel, to Jenne, to Timbuktu, to Cairo, and into the mints of the Mediterranean. By the 1400s, a substantial share of the gold circulating in North Africa and southern Europe had begun its journey in these forests. The trade was ancient. The routes were established. The prices were understood. What arrived in 1471 was not a discovery. It was a competitor. To understand why that mattered, you have to go inland, away from the coast entirely, to a place most people have never heard of, in the forest north of Kumasi, Bego. For roughly 400 years, Bego was one of the largest towns in West Africa. Excavations have found thousands of house mounds spread across separate quarters. One for the local Brong, one for the Muslim Mande traders who came down from the north, one for the smiths and the potters. It sat exactly where the forest ends and the savannah begins, which is not an accident. It is the whole point. The forest produced gold and cola nuts. The savannah produced salt, cloth, copper, horses. Neither could produce the other's goods. Both wanted them. Bego and the Bono state at Bono Manso further east sat on the seam between the two and taxed everything that crossed it. Mande merchants arrived from the great inland cities carrying salt slabs cut in the desert. They left carrying gold dust and cola. That gold went north by donkey, then by camel, over about 60 days of Sahara, to the market towns on the far edge. From there, it went to the coast of North Africa, and from there into Europe. Which meant that by the time an Akan miner's gold reached a merchant in Genoa or Marseille, it had passed through perhaps 6 sets of hands and had crossed the largest desert on Earth. Every one of those hands took something. So when the Portuguese arrived by sea, they were not offering the Akan a market. The Akan already had one, and it was very old. They were offering a shorter route. And they were offering it at the source, which changed the arithmetic completely, for both sides. But the gold itself did not come from Bego, and it did not come from Kumasi. It came out of water. The Ankobra, the Pra, the Ofin, the Birim. Rivers running south out of the forest belt toward the Atlantic, cutting through gold-bearing rock and carrying the metal down with them as sediment. Gold is dense, roughly 19 times the weight of water. So when a river slows at a bend or drops into a pool, the gold falls out of suspension and settles into the gravel at the bottom, while everything lighter keeps moving. Which means a river does the hard part for you. It finds the ore, breaks it up, transports it, and then sorts it by weight and stacks it in predictable places. The work is to know which places. That knowledge was local, it was specific, and it was closely held. Panning in the river gravel, digging shallow pits down to the older buried channels, working the reefs where they surfaced. The Portuguese never got near any of it. They built forts at Elmina, at Axim, at Shama, at Accra. Every one of them within sight of the water, not one of them inland. Partly because they could not. The forest was against them, the diseases were against them, and the states behind the beach were considerably stronger than 400 men in a stone box. But mostly because they were never allowed to. Access to the workings was refused, consistently, for 3 centuries. The Europeans on this coast bought gold. They did not mine it. They did not see it mined. They sat on the shore and waited for it to be brought down to them. And when it arrived as dust. Not nuggets, not bars. Dust. Fine grains, sometimes barely visible, measured out grain by grain on scales so light that a breath could ruin a transaction. The Akan word is sika futuro, gold powder. There is a reason for the powder, and it is a monetary reason. A nugget has one value. You cannot spend part of it. Powder can be divided infinitely, down to a quantity small enough to buy a handful of bananas, and up to a quantity heavy enough to buy a farm, which turns a metal into a currency. But a currency needs trust, and dust is the easiest thing in the world to cheat with. Sand looks like gold dust. Brass filings look like gold dust. So an entire technology grew up around measuring it. Brass weights, cast by the thousand, in geometric forms and in miniature sculptures. A fish, a drum, a sandal, two men sawing a log. Every one of them calibrated to a known standard. The largest common unit, the peridwan, sat at around 2 1/4 troy ounces. Every household kept its own set. Buyer and seller each brought their own weights and their own scales, and negotiated until both sets agreed. Neither party had to trust the other. They only had to trust the brass. The whole kit, weights, scales, brushes, tiny spoons, a box for the dust, travelled in a bag called a futuo. Learning to use it was part of growing up. Keeping it was the responsibility of the head of the household. Some families had two, a small one for daily marketing, a larger one for serious purchases. The smallest scales were known as wind scales, because a draft through a doorway could unbalance them. You did not sneeze while a price was being settled. And any grain that fell to the ground during a transaction was, by rule, no longer yours. It belonged to the state, swept up, collected, and held. Remember that. It comes back at the end of this, in a form nobody in the 18th century would have recognised. 19th of January, 1482. 10 ships come over the horizon off a fishing village the local people call Adina. 600 men are aboard. Soldiers, but also stonemasons, carpenters, craftsmen, 100 of them. And in the holds, cut stone. Granite, quarried in Portugal, shaped in Portugal, numbered in Portugal, and shipped 4,000 kilometres so that it can be unloaded onto a beach and reassembled. The commander is Diogo de Azambuja. He has instructions from King João II to build a fortress here, and to build it fast. He does not have permission. The ruler the Portuguese record as Caramansa is not enthusiastic. There has been trade on this beach for 11 years already, since the first Portuguese ships came in 1471, and it has worked perfectly well without a fort. Negotiations run long. Gifts change hands. Eventually, the land is leased. The fort goes up in a matter of weeks. They call it São Jorge da Mina, St. George of the Mine. King João adds a new line to his titles, Lord of Guinea. It is the first permanent European building south of the Sahara, and 540 years later, it is still standing on that beach. Now, why build it at all? Not for defence against Africans. The garrison could never have held this coast against the states behind it, and everyone involved knew that. It was built against other Europeans. The trade was worth defending. In the decades after the fort went up, The Portuguese were shipping out something in the order of 12,000 ounces of gold a year on the low estimates, and around 24,000 at the peak. Call it 560 kilograms annually by the year 1500. Against Europe's total supply of the metal, that was roughly a tenth, from one beach. And the Crown ran it as a monopoly. All gold to the King's agents at the King's price through the King's fort. 3 more forts followed: Axim, Shama, Accra, spaced along the shore, each one designed to make sure the metal came out through a Portuguese door and no one else's. Which worked, for a while, because of a simple margin. The gold had been going north across the desert. 60 days of camel travel, 6 sets of intermediaries, and a tax at every stage. The Portuguese offered the same metal a shorter journey, and paid for it in goods that had never been available here in quantity: brass basins, copper bracelets, textiles from Flanders and later from India, and, decisively, cloth. For the Akan sellers, this was not surrender. It was a better price. The trans-Saharan route did not die. It thinned. Gold that had gone north for centuries began, in part, to go south instead, because south now paid more. And then there is the other cargo. The mines and the river workings inland needed labour, a great deal of it. Digging shallow pits into buried channels, hauling gravel, carrying loads through forest with no wheeled transport and no draft animals, because the tsetse fly made keeping horses in the forest felt effectively impossible. The Akan states wanted workers. The Portuguese had ships. So Portuguese vessels sailed east and south, to the Bight of Benin and to the Congo coast, bought enslaved people there, carried them back to Elmina, and sold them to Akan buyers, who paid in gold. Read that again, because the direction is the part that gets missed. For the first century of European trade on this coast, enslaved people were an import. They were carried in, and gold was carried out. The ships arriving at São Jorge de Mina brought human beings and left with metal. It is one of the earliest recorded instances of European vessels moving enslaved Africans across water for profit. And its purpose was to increase the output of a gold trade that European buyers wanted more of. The fort was a warehouse for both cargoes. The same building. The same ledgers. The Portuguese held that arrangement for roughly 150 years. The Dutch took the fort in 1637 and the rest of the Portuguese coast by 1642. The English built Cape Coast Castle a few kilometres east. The Danes, the Swedes and the Brandenburgers all took a stretch of shoreline. By the late 1600s, there were something like 40 European forts along this coast. Perhaps the densest concentration of fortification anywhere in the world per kilometre of shore. All of them facing the sea. All of them buying, not taking, and competing so hard against each other that the price paid for gold on the beach went up, which pulled more of the metal south rather than north, which is exactly what each of them wanted. Then, over about 80 years, the trade inverted. The demand that changed it was not here. It was 4,000 miles west. Sugar plantations in the Caribbean and Brazil needed labour on a scale nothing in Europe could supply. The price offered for a human being on the West African coast rose, and kept rising, decade after decade. At the same time, the price of gold, fixed against silver in European mints, did not. So the relative value of the two cargoes crossed, and a trade that had run one way began to run the other. By 1706, in a period of 30 months, English ships had carried more than 10,000 captives out of Cape Coast alone. The mechanism underneath it was firearms, and it was circular. Guns and gunpowder were bought from the forts. Guns won wars. Wars produced captives. Captives were sold at the forts, and the payment bought more guns. Once a neighbouring state was armed, not arming yourself was not a survivable position. Every party in the region was pulled into it by the logic of the last transaction. The Akwamu tried to stop the raiding on their borders, and then took it up themselves. Traders from one state were seized on the roads and sold by another. States that had grown wealthy on gold now grew wealthier on people, and states that refused were absorbed by the ones that did not. And gold production fell, not because the ground gave out, but because the labour and the attention had moved. Which is what that Dutch official was recording in 1726, in a sentence that reads, 300 years later, like an accountant noticing the columns have swapped. The coast should be renamed. Somewhere between 800,000 and 1.5 million people were carried out of this shoreline over the course of the trade. The castles they were held in are still there, at Elmina and Cape Coast, kept as they were. The dungeons are below ground level. There is a passage from them to a door in the sea wall. It is the same building the gold came through. Now go inland. 200 kilometres north of the surf, into the forest the Europeans never entered. Kumasi. In 1701, a confederation of Akan states, under a ruler named Osei Tutu, broke the kingdom of Denkira in battle. Denkira had sat between the goldfields and the coast, and had taxed everything moving between them. With Denkira gone, the Asante held the goldfields and the road. What they built on top of that is the part of this story that almost nobody outside Ghana knows. They built a monetary state, not a hoard, not a treasury of ornaments, a functioning currency system with a unit of account, a central reserve, a standards authority, and a rule of law about the money. Gold dust became legal tender across the empire. Under Osei Tutu, it was formalised. The sika futuro that had circulated in markets became the medium in which taxes were paid, fines were levied, tribute was assessed, and debts were settled. The peridwan was the top denomination. Everything below it, down to the smallest transaction in a village market, was measured against the same brass weights. The state controlled the supply directly. Mining was regulated, where, when, and by whom. Nuggets above a certain size belonged to the Asantehene by law, and were surrendered to the palace, where the state's own goldsmiths melted them and converted them into dust. That is not a decorative rule. That is a central bank controlling the issue of currency. There was a chief goldsmith at court, the Adwamfuahini, occupying a stool that predated the empire itself and had come down from Denkira. Under him, workshops of craftsmen bound into guilds, working to a standard the palace set. And in the palace complex at Kumasi, the treasury. 2 chests kept in separate rooms. The Adaka Kesi, the big box, and the Apim Adaka, the box of 1,000. The big box held the reserve. Nothing smaller than 1 peridwan was ever deposited into it, and nothing smaller than 1 peridwan was ever taken out. The small box handled the day-to-day, a current account and a petty cash account, run in gold powder, in a palace in the middle of a rainforest. In the early 1800s, keeping the big box full required something in the order of 400,000 ounces of gold dust. British estimates in 1875 put the value of that chest at about £1.5 million sterling. That is one room in one building. Private treasure in the city was on a similar scale. One Kumasi household's holdings were assessed in 1824 at 45,000 ounces. Which raises the question that has been sitting under this whole story. Why did the Europeans never go inland? Because they were never dealing with a supplier. They were dealing with a state that had a reserve currency, a standards regime, a professional merchant class, an army, and the ability to close the road whenever it chose to. The forts on the beach were not the powerful end of that relationship. They were the end that waited. When the Asante wanted the price up, they slowed the flow. When a European company misbehaved, its supply stopped. When Kumasi went to war, gold production in the affected districts fell, and the ledgers in the forts recorded the fall without ever knowing why. And there is a detail in the Asante system that says more about it than any of the figures. Gold spilled on the ground during a transaction was swept up and became state property. Not the shopkeepers, not the customers, the nations. Held deliberately against a bad year. A country running a sovereign reserve out of the sweepings of its own marketplaces. There is a version of this story where that is the ending. A place that understood its own metal better than anyone buying it and kept the margin. That version lasted about 200 years. The Asante fought the British 4 times across the 19th century. In 1874, a British force burned Kumasi. In 1896, the Asantehene was deposed and deported. In 1900 came a final war, and in 1901, the territory was annexed by order in council on the grounds that it had been conquered. And in that same year, 1901, gold dust ceased to be legal currency. 200 years of monetary architecture, the weights, the scales, the peridwan, the 2 chests, were declared administratively not to be money anymore. British coin replaced it. The brass weights became objects. They sit now in museums in London, in Basel, in Accra, catalogued as sculpture. They were never sculpture. They were the instruments of a functioning economy, and they are exhibited as art because the economy they belonged to was ended by statute. But something else had already started, 22 years earlier, in a village in the Aquapem Hills. And it had nothing to do with metal. 1879. A blacksmith is planting seeds in a patch of ground at Mampong. His name is Tete Kwashi. He is Gar, born around 1842 near Accra, trained under the Basel missionaries at Akrapong, good enough at the trade to have opened his own forge. 9 years earlier, he went to work on the Spanish island of Fernando Po, off the coast of Cameroon. He spent 6 years there, on cocoa plantations. Cocoa was a controlled crop. The planting stock was not meant to leave. He came home in 1876, and he brought pods with him. Others had tried this before and failed. Missionaries, Dutch traders, mostly because they fermented or dried the beans first, which kills them. Kwashi did not make that mistake. He knew, from 6 years of doing it, which part of the process the seed survives. The first harvest comes in 1883. The first export leaves in 1885. 2 bags. He sells pods to his neighbours at £1 each. They plant them. They sell pods on. And then the thing spreads at a speed nobody planned or funded or supervised. By the turn of the century, exports are running at a couple of thousand tons a year. By 1904, 5,000 tons. By 1911, 40,000 tons. And the Gold Coast is the largest cocoa producer on Earth, ahead of every plantation economy in the Americas. Around a third of the world's supply, inside 30 years of one man's seed pods. And here is what makes it unlike almost every other colonial export crop. It was not planted by companies. There were no estates, no European plantations, no land grants. It was grown by African smallholders on land bought or held under African tenure, financed out of African savings, planted by families who worked out for themselves that cocoa on this soil returned something like 10 times what oil palm did. Farmers migrated west into the forest to plant it. They formed land buying companies. They built roads to reach the railheads before the government did. The colonial agricultural department set up nurseries afterwards. At Aburi, in the hills above Accra, the governor established a station to distribute pods. Afterwards, the farmers were already 20 years ahead of it. The bean itself explains part of the speed. Cocoa needs a specific set of conditions: shade, no frost, roughly 1,500 millimeters of rain a year, a dry spell to concentrate the pods, and deep soil. The forest belt behind this coast supplies all of it without irrigation, without terracing, without machinery. A tree begins bearing in 4 or 5 years. It produces pods on the trunk, not the branch tips, so harvesting is done at chest height with a blade. There is no equipment to buy, which means the barrier to entry is close to zero, and a family with land and 5 years of patience can enter a global commodity market. The processing is where the value goes. Beans are fermented for about a week, dried in the sun, and shipped raw. Everything after that, roasting, grinding, conching, the making of chocolate, happens somewhere with a cold chain and a factory. Historically, the grower's share of the price of a finished bar has sat in the single digits, the same shape as the gold. The thing comes out of the ground here. It becomes valuable somewhere else. Tete Kwashi died on Christmas Day 1892, before the boom he started reached its scale. Plant patents did not exist for him and would not have applied. In 1926, his relatives petitioned the colonial governor for some recognition of what the family had given the colony's economy. The petition sat for 2 years. In 1928, they were granted £250, against an industry that was, by then, the largest of its kind in the world. Meanwhile, on the other side of the forest, London had noticed the metal again. The Anglo-Asante Wars of the 1870s had brought European soldiers, surveyors and travellers deep into country that had been closed to them for 400 years. They came back out talking. One of them reported that in Ashanti you could pick up gold the way you would pick up potatoes. That is a quotation, and it is nonsense, and it did precisely what nonsense of that kind always does. Between 1890 and 1901, London floated concession after concession on the Gold Coast. Companies were registered, prospectuses printed, shares quoted, and the financial press carried the prices daily. They called it the Jungle Boom. Most of it was paper, a concession on a map, a name with the word Ashanti in it, a share price, and an investor in Kent who had never seen the Atlantic. Companies were floated over ground nobody had walked. Ore reserves were estimated by men who had not sampled them. Share prices moved on rumour and on the death of a director, and on the state of the crushing machinery 6,000 kilometres away, reported 4 months late. And when the Boer War closed down South African production between 1899 and 1902, capital that had nowhere else to go came west, and the prices went up again. Two things were true at once on this coast in 1900. Gold was being pulled out of the ground at Tarkwa and Obuasi in real quantities by real machinery at grades that were among the best in the world. And the market in the thing was largely fictional. The fortunes made in that decade were mostly made in London, on the movement of paper by people who never touched an ounce. But the ore was real, and moving it required something that had never existed here. Everything before this had gone out on human backs. No wheeled transport through the forest, no draft animals surviving the Tsetse belt. Cargo moved by headload at walking pace along footpaths, which sets a hard ceiling on any economy. If your export has to be carried, then your export has to be worth a great deal per kilogram. Gold dust is worth a great deal per kilogram. That is precisely why gold was the export for 600 years. Rock is not. Neither is a sack of cocoa beans. So in the 1890s, the colonial administration began laying rail from the coast inland, and the route tells you exactly what it was for. The line ran from Sekondi on the shore to Tarkwa, reached in May 1901. 18 months later, it was extended another 140 kilometres to Obuasi. In September 1903, it reached Kumasi. Goldfield, Goldfield, capital, in that order. A second line went north from Accra. A deep-water harbour was built at Takoradi in the 1920s to take ships that could not use the surf ports. And the effect on the cocoa farmers was enormous and largely accidental. A crop that had been walked to the coast could now be railed to it. The forest frontier of planting moved west along the track, because the track was what made distance affordable. The infrastructure was built to move ore out. What it actually moved, in tonnage, was beans. Still, the geometry of the whole thing points one way. Every line ran from an interior to a port. Not one of them connected two interior towns to each other. There is an animal that belongs in this story, and it is not here for scenery. The African forest elephant. Smaller than its savanna cousin, straighter tusks, ears more rounded. It moves through dense forest in family groups, dispersing the seeds of more than 100 tree species as it goes, some of which will not germinate at all unless they have passed through one. The forest belt behind this coast was full of them. Their ivory left through the same forts as the gold, listed in the same cargo manifests, priced in the same ounces. There are a few hundred left in Ghana now, in fragments of protected forest. The herds that ranged from the Volta to the Ancobra are gone. But the animal did not disappear from the record. In 1663, King Charles II granted a charter to a company of merchants trading to Africa. The company's badge was an elephant, later an elephant and a castle. And as an encouragement to bring gold home to be minted, the company was permitted to stamp that badge on the coins struck from the metal it imported. So the guinea carries an elephant beneath the king's head. It is a maker's mark, a supply chain label 400 years early. It tells you which company's gold made this particular coin. The charter that authorised it listed what the company was licensed to trade in: redwood, elephant's teeth, wax, hides, gold, and people. The same document, the same sentence. The coin in a London pocket in 1680 was named after this coast, stamped with an animal from this forest, and issued under a charter that priced human beings from this shoreline in the same list as the metal. That is the guinea. That is what the word means. And nobody spending one had to think about any of it, which was rather the point of a coin. Which brings this to a single square mile of forest, about 60 kilometres south of Kumasi, in country that had belonged to the old kingdom of Denkira and had been worked for gold since at least the 1600s. Obuasi. In March 1890, 3 merchants from Cape Coast take a concession there. Joseph Etruson Ellis, Chief Joseph Edward Biney, their accountant, Joseph Peter Brown. They are Fante. They are businessmen. They negotiate the lease directly with the Bekwai over 100 square miles of ground, and they open a mine on it. They call it the Ellis Mine, and they run it for 5 years, bringing in the first industrial methods the district has seen. This is worth stating plainly because it tends to vanish from the telling. The first modern mine at Obuasi was found, financed, staked, and operated by Africans. In 1895, they agree to sell. The buyer is a London clerk named Edwin Arthur Cade. He has had the ore assayed. The result is 10.5 ounces to the ton. Cade knows exactly what he is holding. He writes to his backers that he intends to proceed at all risks, and to position the company so that it will be well placed in the event that the government annexes the territory. He is not speculating on the geology, he is speculating on the sovereignty. In July 1895, he travels to Obuasi with Ellis and Biney to get the transfer approved by the chiefs of Bekwai and Adansi. In 1896, the Asantehene is deposed and Ashanti passes under direct British control. In June 1897, the governor of the Gold Coast ratifies Cade's concession, a lease of 99 years. 11th of June, 1897. Cade registers the Ashanti Goldfields Corporation in London. Nominal capital £250,000 in 250,000 shares of £1 each. It is listed on the London Stock Exchange the same day. The 3 men who found the gold, staked the ground, worked it for 5 years and proved it commercially, received £200 in deposit money. £200 against a company floated at 250,000. That is the transaction. That is the whole shape of 500 years, compressed into a single line in a ledger in Cornhill. The work that followed was brutal, and it was real. 40 tons of equipment dragged and carried nearly 200 kilometers inland from the coast before the railway existed. Adit mining. Horizontal tunnels driven into the hillside rather than shafts sunk from above, laid out by an engineer named John Dorr. The first year produced 2,544 ounces. The second, 4,673. Then the railway arrived in late 1902, and the constraint that had governed this coast for 600 years, that everything must be carried on a back, was gone. Output went up. The company stayed listed for over a century. Obuasi became known in the trade as the richest square mile in Africa. And it was not alone. The same belt of rock throws up a line of mining towns across the southwest of the country. Tarkwa on the old alluvial workings, Prestia deep in the Ankobra Valley, Bibiani in the forest to the north, Konongo on the Kumasi Road. Every one of them a company town, laid out around a headframe and a compound, with a rail spur running out and nothing much running in. They were not built to be places, they were built to be exits. Edwin Cade did not see much of it. He died of malaria in 1903, at 46, in a village on the Offin River. He is buried in the European cemetery at Obuasi, a few hundred meters from the mine he registered. One colonial administrator among the headstones, in ground he had signed away from the people who lived on it 6 years after he signed it. "54 years later, the country took itself back. March 1957. The Gold Coast becomes Ghana, the first colony in sub-Saharan Africa to take independence, named after a medieval empire that had stood 1,000 kilometers to the northwest and had also been famous for gold. And it does not arrive poor. It arrives as the largest cocoa exporter on Earth. It holds a substantial share of world gold production and exports diamonds, bauxite, manganese, and timber besides. Foreign reserves stand at somewhere above $500 million. Liquid assets are several times long-term debt. Income per head is roughly level with South Korea's in the same year. Ghana in 1957 is the wealthiest country in sub-Saharan Africa, and it is not close. The reserves have a specific origin, and the origin matters. During the Second World War, the British had set up a control board to buy the colony's cocoa at a fixed price. After the war, it became the Cocoa Marketing Board, one buyer. The board set the price paid to the farmer, sold the crop on the world market, and kept the difference. In good years, the difference was very large. The board's job, officially, was to smooth prices, to hold back money in high years and pay it out in low ones. In practice, it was the state's principal source of revenue. The reserves that Ghana carried into independence were, to a considerable degree, the accumulated spread between what farmers were paid and what their cocoa sold for. The wealthiest country in the region was capitalized out of the margin on its own smallholders. And then the price of the thing turned. In the second half of 1964, the West African crop came in enormous. Ghana alone produced a record 538,000 tons. A record harvest in a commodity with inelastic demand does not make a country richer. It makes the price fall. The world cocoa price collapsed. After the board's purchasing and marketing costs were met, there was effectively nothing left for the treasury. The board's liquidity was close to exhausted. The government began printing money to meet its expenses. Inflation ran about 35% between October 1964 and July 1965. Producer prices paid to farmers were cut to their lowest level in years. The reserves that had stood above $500 million in 1957 were gone by 1966. Foreign debt stood at around $1 billion, much of it short-term. 9 years. Some of that money had gone into a river. The Volta River project was meant to end the dependency altogether. A dam at Akosombo, a lake behind it, and enough electricity to build an industrial economy that would never again live or die on the price of a bean. The problem was that a dam of that size is only financeable if it has a customer large enough to guarantee the load from day one. There was exactly one kind of customer that fitted: an aluminium smelter, the most electricity-hungry industrial process in commercial use, where power is not an input cost, but very nearly the entire cost. So the terms of the dam were written around a smelter. The Volta Aluminium Company was built at Tema on the coast, backed by American capital, on a long-term contract for electricity at a rate fixed decades ahead. It took a very large share of everything Akosombo produced. Accounts of the period put it at somewhere between 50% and 70%. And the raw material did not come from Ghana. Ghana has bauxite, considerable quantities of it, but the smelter ran on alumina shipped in from elsewhere, because the refinery to turn Ghanaian bauxite into Ghanaian alumina was never built. So the finished arrangement was this: a Ghanaian river, a Ghanaian dam, Ghanaian electricity sold at a fixed low price, imported raw material, and aluminium ingots leaving through a Ghanaian port. Everything except the ore and the value. The dam itself remains the backbone of the country's power supply, and the lake behind it supports a fishing economy that did not exist before. The contract was renegotiated in the 1980s, and the plant eventually passed into Ghanaian hands. But the shape of the original deal is the shape of everything else in this story. Which brings this back to Obuasi. Same square mile, same reef. 128 years after Cade rang the bell in London, in 2025, Ghana produced around 6 million ounces of gold, more than the Portuguese took in any year of the MENA trade, more than the British took in any year of the colony, more than Mali, more than Burkina Faso, more than South Africa, more than any country on the African continent. Gold export earnings came in at somewhere close to $21 billion, roughly double the year before. Around 63% of everything the country sold abroad. Cocoa, in its best export year on record, brought in $3.8 billion. Oil, $2.6. The gold is worth more than both of them put together, twice over. And the largest single driver of that increase was not a new industrial mine. It was the state deciding to buy from the people who had been digging anyway. Across the forest belt, in the river gravels of the Pra, the Offen, the Ankobra, the same rivers, the same buried channels the Akan were working 600 years ago, hundreds of thousands of people mine gold by hand and by pump and by excavator. The Ghanaian word for it is galamsey. Much of it operates outside license. It supports something in the order of 1 million livelihoods. It also silts and poisons the rivers it works in, with mercury for the amalgam and cyanide for the leach. And it has taken cocoa farms out of production by digging up the land they stood on. Two of the country's exports eating each other. In 2025, a state body was created to centralise the buying of that gold, to purchase artisanal output through a single legal channel and put it on the official books, instead of leaving it to walk over a border in a bag. The metal had always been there. What changed was that it was counted. Which is a very old idea in a very new form. Golds that fell to the ground in an Asante market belonged to the state. It was swept up, held, and kept against a bad year. 3 centuries later, the same principle applied to the sweepings of a river. And still, the ore leaves. Ghana mines the gold. Ghana does not, in any meaningful quantity, refine it. Doré bars and concentrate go out to refineries in Switzerland, in South Africa, in the Gulf, where the metal is brought to 4 nines of purity, cast, certified, and sold at a price set in London. The mines themselves are mostly not Ghanaian. The great majority of large-scale production is foreign-owned, with the state holding a minority stake. The metal comes out of the same rock that the Akan worked before anyone had drawn a map of this coastline. It is weighed somewhere else, it is priced somewhere else, it is finished somewhere else. The same sentence, with the century changed, 5 times over. Portuguese gold, weighed at a fort on the beach and priced in Lisbon. Guinea gold, carried home and priced at the mint. Obuasi ore, dug at 10.5 ounces to the tonne and quoted in Cornhill. Cocoa, fermented under the sun here and made into chocolate in Zurich and Birmingham. Bauxite country, running a smelter on someone else's alumina. And that is the answer to the thing this started with. The coast that gave gold its name was never short of gold. It has more of it now, by weight, than at any moment in 500 recorded years. What it has never held, for any length of time, is the place where the value gets decided. That is not a resource story. Resources do not have this shape. This is a story about position. About being, in every century, one step upstream of the room where the price is set. 12,000 ounces a year to Lisbon, 24,000 at the peak. A coin named after the shore. A coin bearing an elephant from the forest behind it. £200 for the richest square mile in Africa. 6 million ounces in a single year, sailing out unrefined. All of it the same transaction, wearing different clothes. Elmina Castle is still there, on its spit of rock between the lagoon and the sea. Whitewashed, square, older than every other European building south of the Sahara, and older than most of the ones north of it. School groups come through in the mornings. The courtyard is bright and hot and open to the sky. The rooms below are not. The storerooms that held the gold and the chambers that held people are in the same walls, separated by a staircase. That was not a later adaptation. Both were designed in, from the beginning, by men in Lisbon working from a drawing. Cape Coast Castle sits a few kilometres east and does the same thing in a different accent. Both are World Heritage Sites now. Both are visited every year by Ghanaians and by descendants of the people who left through them. And in the hills above Accra, at Mampong in Aquapem, there is a tree. The original cocoa tree that Tete Kwashi planted in 1879 died a long time ago. What stands on the site is grown from it, on the ground where a blacksmith put seeds he was not supposed to have into soil nobody had tried them in. It is a small memorial for the largest thing anybody on this coast ever started. £250 in 1928 to the family. As for the coin, the guinea was struck for the last time in 1814. 2 years later, Britain moved to the gold standard. The Coinage Act replaced it with the sovereign, and the denomination stopped existing as a piece of metal you could hold. The word did not stop. It is still in use in a handful of places for no practical reason at all. Racehorses are sold in guineas. Rams are sold in guineas. 2 of the oldest flat races in England are named after it. At an auction, a thing is knocked down at 100 guineas rather than £100, so that the seller takes the £100 and the auctioneer takes the 5 extra shillings. A unit that survives as a convenience for the person taking the commission. There is no better description of the whole arrangement than that. It is a strange kind of monument. Not a statue, not a plaque. A habit of speech in an English saleroom, 200 years after the last one was minted. Still carrying the name of a coastline 4,000 miles away that most of the people using the word could not place on a map. The metal in those coins came out of rivers behind this shore. It was found by people who knew where the gravel held it, weighed on scales so fine that a draught could unsettle them, priced against brass weights cast in the shape of a fish or a sandal, and sold at a fort on a beach by traders who set their own terms and, for a very long time, got them. None of that survives in the word. The word only kept the geography. Perhaps that is what a name is in the end. Not a record of who made a thing, or who found it, or who carried it. Only a record of where the ships stopped. The coast is still called the Gold Coast, informally, by people here. The country took a different name in 1957, Ghana, borrowed from an empire that traded the same metal 1,000 kilometers away and 1,000 years earlier. The gold is still in the ground. 6 million ounces of it came out last year, and the rock is not close to finished. What happens to it after it leaves has been the question on this shoreline for 500 years. It is still the question. The difference is that for the first time in a long while, the people asking it are the ones standing on the rock. Thanks for watching. Until the next